So here's the thing about this. If you ever seen West Side Story, where there's supposed to be these two gangs, the Sharks and the Jets, if you've seen the movie, the play adaptation of the movie, and the dancers are very gay and effeminate, right? But they're supposed to be gang members. And you've seen this in Hollywood for a number of years. There's been this effeminate, there's a lot of gay people that went to Hollywood in the 1920s, 1930s, and they started, and people who have that type of personality, people who are dramatic, drama queens, men who like to dress up as women, have always been in as actors all the way back until in Shakespearean days, when all the female parts were played by men in drag, men dressed up as women. And so there was always this effeminate part of Hollywood in this culture. But Michael Jackson made it something where, when I grew up, I had just graduated high school. This was 5 years after I graduated high school when this was happening. And in my high school and then throughout my college years, I didn't know anybody who was a Michael Jackson fan. I mean, there weren't as many Michael Jackson fans back then when these videos were coming out, because he was very effeminate and he was weird. And you joke about, you would mock your friends or whatever and call them Michael Jackson, or, I mean, back then everybody would be considered homophobic by today's standards, right? There was this, men were expected to be more manly, and Michael Jackson came on the scenes, and the majority of people back then, the majority of older people and some younger people, were put off by this guy. He was really weird for his time, and he just kept on getting weirder. And he built up some sort of fan base, but it was the generations after that. They grew up when they were children when Michael Jackson was in the height of his career, and then afterwards, because pop music sort of exploded and Michael Jackson was more and more accepted. And so there was this feminization of the male population, which I covered in this earlier videos, right? And there's the effeminate movements. But here are these guys that are supposed to be thugs, and they're talking about Michael Jackson. He's not bad because he's not gangster. And Michael Jackson's saying he can be effeminate. He can be somebody who's weak and sort of girly and still be bad. And he proves this by his effeminate dancing and these dancers that are with him. And the whole thing changed the dynamics to where women were told now that you like these effeminate. There was glam rockers, whatever they were called, glam rocker or whatever it was, Kiss and some of these other bands, and they put on makeup. I mean, people mentioned this in comments. So that was already out there. But Michael Jackson brought this to a popular... Michael Jackson made this popular, where women started thinking about men in makeup, men who were effeminate, as being sex symbols, all these things, that they really pushed Michael Jackson. All these people say, the powers that be didn't like Michael Jackson. Bullshit, because he was pushed and thrust onto the American public. When they celebrated him on MTV, they pushed all his videos, they pushed him on everybody. And again, I didn't know one Michael Jackson fan. You'd go to clubs and you would never hear a Michael Jackson song. You'd go to a disco or dance club in these places. You never heard Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was not nearly as popular during this time, right? But he was always on TV. He was always, in various types of pop music radio stations. He was certainly always on MTV, and they gave him royal treatment, and they pushed him. He was marketed, and it was because of his feminization and all these things, his girlishness and things. And then later on, the young people that grew up when Michael Jackson was in his heyday became his fans later on, and he got more popularity. And certainly on a global basis, Michael Jackson was very popular. But in terms of the rest of us, people who, we didn't understand how this weirdo, this really weird dude, somebody who was just incredibly effeminate and just bizarre type of person, was so popular, right? I just never liked the guy, and there was lots of people like me. And it's the same thing you see now on YouTube and these places where they're pushing this idea, where they're having drag queens have story time on libraries. There are lots of parents that don't want that, right? And when you go to any of these types of, I covered this in my recent video. You see these YouTube channels that are being promoted with guys doing makeup and this effeminization of men. The same thing they did with Michael Jackson. And Michael Jackson, it's a time released, the Michael Jackson effect, where you now see guys in makeup, cover boy, and all these things. And women and young women and girls are being sexualized to these boys and saying, you should have a girly man, even though you're biologically and physically and spiritually attracted to a real man, somebody who embraces the natural gender roles, because they're natural gender roles. These roles are natural gender roles in nature. You know that each species has a specific gender role. Dogs and insects and each specific species has their own set of gender roles and gender norms. And each gender, and again, it's not always the same thing. Like in a praying mantis, the female insect is much bigger than the male insect, and the female insect, like, oftentimes consumes her mate. I mean, there's things that are different in each species, but for the most part, there are very specific gender norms and gender roles. And now the modern day culture is saying, let's reverse those things completely. Let's make women the more kick-ass, the more physical, the more dominant of the species, and let's effeminize men, even though size-wise and in terms of testosterone, I mean, this is stuff where you're going to see men hemorrhaging their testosterone, right? Not having the ability to reproduce, because that's what happens when you change the gender norms. When you effeminize men, they stop producing as much testosterone. Then you add the Wi-Fi and the various types of chemicals and the phytoestrogens in the environment. Already men's sperm count is basically at as low as you can get and still reproduce. It's been cut in half since the 1970s. Men's sperm counts on average have decreased by half since the 1970s.